Welcome in the room. Welcome to those of you who are joining us virtually online to the School of Media and Public Affairs National Council meeting. We've been having a very rich discussion, and I look forward to more here. I'm Frank Sesno. I now have the title of Director of Strategic Initiatives here at the School of Media and Public Affairs, and there are a lot of strategic initiatives. And one of the most important strategic initiatives is the work that my colleague Rebekah Tromble is doing at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, where we're looking at disinformation, online harms, and a whole bunch of things that we know too well. In fact, there's a really interesting story in the Post just today involving Tony Fauci and alleged work and that he supported on beagles, dogs, that didn't happen, but that resulted in thousands and thousands of attacks. Part of the strategic initiative that we stand for too is meeting, greeting, and embracing the work that our students, our faculty, our alumni, and our fellow National Council members do. And Jacob Helberg is here, and he's going to be speaking about the book in conversation with Rebekah. Let me say just a word or two about each of these two wonderful people whom I know quite well. I'm going to start with Jacob, because I have to start with Jacob, because when Jacob was a student, he and I got to know one another actually quite well. He was a student at the Elliott School of International Affairs because of his interest because of his roots in France, and because I'm a bit of a francophone myself. We found many things to talk about. We had many coffees, and the coffees really wandered the range of issues about our world, about the kind of work that one person could do, about the role that media played, and about France. And I am thrilled to see the trajectory that Jacob has had culminating in this book. His book springs from his work at Google, and he'll talk about that, where he was the lead looking at global news policy. It was a phenomenal thing. It was one of the reasons that we reached out to Jacob with such alacrity here for this National Council, because what we do here at the School of Media and Public Affairs, journalism, mass communication, and political communication, ties directly into what's happening in places like Google. And so Jacob's expertise and his interest in this space is really phenomenal, and it's really very, very important for us. Rebekah Tromble is a dear friend, colleague, and we are co-PIs on the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, of which she is the director and the leader, and really sets the research and the engagement direction entirely. We were fortunate enough here at School of Media and Public Affairs to hire her from Leiden University in the Netherlands, where she was already working on a variety of very important research and work relating to online harm, social media, and really interestingly, the role of regulation and policy, and what the EU could do and what European governments could do. And they're way ahead of us here in the United States for a variety of reasons. And that work that she's done, she has continued here and expanded upon, as you mentioned earlier, just back from Brussels, where we were engaging with the EU and others, bringing this expertise, bringing this passion for addressing these online harms, which are intense, to what we consider to be true impact-driven research that we hope will affect, I think we are confident, will affect policy here and how we're proceeding. Rebekah is going to engage Jacob in a discussion about his new book, which we have right there, The Wires of War Technology and the Global Struggle for Power. I'm going to turn it over to them, and I'm going to be an eager listener, but I'm going to start with a not too dramatic reading of one paragraph in the beginning of Jacob's book, which I commend to you. It's a very, actually, I find, moving personal journey, professional journey, but also vital geopolitical, technological journey with what's at stake right now. But here's what Jacob writes, and then I will commend it to the two of you. I'm a technologist, he writes. Like most of my peers in Silicon Valley, I came to Northern California because I believe in the tech industry's broader mission to help people around the world live more fulfilling lives. But over the 3+ years that I worked at Google, my day-to-day experience gradually became defined less by dreamy optimism and more by something darker. I found myself drafted into service on a pivotal battlefield of rapidly expanding clash between democracy and autocracy, a conflict between fundamentally incompatible systems of global governance simmering just below the threshold of conventional war. With that as a curtain raiser, I turn it over to the two. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. And though this truly was not planned, I had that exact.
Oh, no.
Earmark. No, this is exactly right. I was going to start off with that. So you read, and I need not. But what I will start off with is my Jon Stewart Daily Show moment, where I indeed put the book in front. This is what we're discussing today, Jacob's excellent book, The Wires of War, Technology, and the Global Struggle for Power. Jacob, I'm really happy that we get to have this conversation. I was fascinated by the book for a number of reasons, and have quite a few questions that I'd like to ask you to help us dig into this. But if we could start from essentially the beginning, right? The main premise of the book is that Western democracies are now engaged in dangerous, essentially cyber war with Russia, Iran, and particularly China. Could you, tell our audience a bit more about both the core premise of the book, but also what ultimately inspired you to write this?
So I'll just start with my answer in chronological order. When I worked at Google, and a lot of the issues that I raised in the book about Google, it's important to note, are not singular to Google, but really are applicable to the tech industry as a whole. I realized that one of the things that the tech industry was struggling with was wrestling with a lot of new emerging trends that the country had never seen before. The basic premise is that governments were increasingly viewing and treating technology companies as both tools and targets of geopolitical jockeying, which was a complete paradigm shift from the more idealistic days of this basic idea that the open-net is completely open and free. If you think about when I was a student here at GW 11 years ago, and back in the day, one of the main events taking place in geopolitics was the Arab Spring. And Hillary Clinton actually came to this building to give an incredible speech on internet freedom that was really interesting, where she basically talked about how the internet was being a vehicle for liberation in a lot of these countries that were allowing movements, leaderless movements, to organize, assemble, express ideas, and essentially try to reach for democracy in ways that were previously impossible. They were toppling, the internet was fueling efforts to topple decades-long autocracies that have been in power, like the Mubarak regime. But she also talked about how, just like steel can be used to build a machine gun or a hospital, these technologies are neutral. And so effectively what happened in the years after 2010, 2011, by 2014, 2015, 2016, the Russian, Iranian, and Chinese government started scrambling for their lives, trying to centralize their political power and political control over the internet to prevent experiencing the same fate than what the Egyptian government had experienced to retain power. And by the mid-2010s, the Russians had started using the internet to not just survive politically at home, but to go on offense abroad against democracy. And so obviously what happened in 2016 in many ways was a proof of concept that the Chinese government and the Iranian government are now emulating. And fundamentally, the starting point for the book is to have a holistic conversation about this broader pattern of governments using technologies in unforeseen ways to engage in political warfare. And the basic idea that war is not completely binary. It's not you're either in a complete state of peace with rainbows and bunnies, or you're all-out nuclear war. It's a spectrum. And the basic intellectual exercise that I was engaged in was, how does one define and describe the current paradigm that we find ourselves in geopolitically at a time when gray zone conflict has become a predominant feature in international politics that drives more and more day-to-day events because of major technological changes and because dual use technologies are now embedded in almost every aspect of our everyday lives. And that's why where I landed ultimately was to call this struggle for power a great war.
That's fantastic. One of the things that really leaped out at me as I was reading this is the focus specifically on hardware, on devices, right, on cables, on literally the wires, right, of war here. We were talking just an hour ago with the other members of the SMPA National Council about problems with technology and the platforms. And we in that discussion, just like the vast majority of the public discourse, were focused on algorithms and content. And this book addresses some of that, but it really focuses first and foremost on essentially the actual tangible things, the hardware and so on. And I wonder what you think we're missing in our larger discourse when we focus more narrowly on algorithms and content to the absence of the more tangible components of this.
Yeah, so in a way, the book isn't just a book about the US and China and geopolitics, but it's really a book about systems, political systems that fundamentally are optimized to do very different things and that operate on technological systems that are clashing with one another. And so the reason that I talk about software, hardware, is basically to paint a holistic picture of a lot of the news headlines that we read every day about Huawei and ZTE and disinformation, and to basically tie it into a comprehensive view that basically divvies up the technology world. In the tech space, you basically have two buckets of different things. You have the world of bits and the world of atoms. And the world of bits is software, the world of atoms is hardware. And at the end of the day, there's a hierarchy to these things where if you control a network at the hardware level, you can compromise and interfere with everything that runs on top of that network. And that's why the bigger emphasis, obviously the thrust of my work at Google was on the software piece and on disinformation and foreign interference operation. But if, the reason that I put the bigger emphasis on the book on China is because there's only two major players in the hardware space in what I call the back end of the war, and that's the US and China. And if China is able to export its information infrastructure through Huawei and ZTE, it can compromise and control everything that runs on top of it, which is incredibly corrosive to the national sovereignty of a lot of democracies.
That's profound, like scary in many ways. And what it does is bring together, and the book, right, brings together in, I think, really powerful, really effective way, perspectives on technology and international relations, right? And these are two fields that we actually don't see in dialogue with one another very much. What is it that you would say about your background, right, that particularly well prepared you to tell this story at the intersection of international relations and technology?
Well, I think in a way having this conversation here at GW is actually incredibly fitting because I think one of the experiences in my life that's given me a lot of familiarity with Washington and government was actually my time living here in Washington. And I think that, that the experience that I gained living here, then spending time in Silicon Valley and working at a tech company, is actually, it's the combination of those two experiences that allowed me to pick up on these different trends and see, I have a whole chapter in my book that's devoted to talking about the rift between the hill and the valley and how it's incredibly important for those two communities to have a better relationship and a more collaborative relationship to solve a lot of the big picture problems that the country faces. Because at the end of the day, technology isn't the solution to all our problems, but it's going to be a component of whatever solution we develop to tackle almost any problem we face. And so, that's one of the reasons why I'm a very big proponent of more cross-pollination between these two communities. And obviously, my inclination for favoring collaboration on both sides stems from my experience both here as well as in Silicon Valley.
That's great. I'm realizing now, Jacob, that I should have mentioned to the audience on Zoom at the very beginning that we're welcoming any questions that you might have. Feel free to drop those in the Q&A. In a minute, I'll ask another question or two. We'll give those who are here in person as well online the opportunity to ask any questions that they might have of you.
I'm just gonna ask you that you speak a little louder.
Oh, okay, yes, we'll project a little bit more. You mentioned as you were describing, right, the sort of main argument of the book, at the very end, you touched on a concept that's really at the heart of much of your discussion. That's the notion of the gray war, right? And you told us at a fairly high level, right, why you don't think it's quite as simple as either all rainbows and bunnies, right, or an all-out hot war. But the notion of a gray war is something that we don't encounter very much, right? The midpoint that most people would be used to thinking about is Cold War. So why is it specifically that you use this term gray war as opposed to Cold War?
So there is a brief passage in the book where I basically say that I don't think the difference is between Gray War and Cold War. It's not that different, but I do think that the term gray war is more accurate because there are dynamics at work today that are different from the days of the Cold War because the world is obviously very different. In many ways, I mean, obviously the think tank community has written at length about the fact that we didn't have any trade with the Soviet Union. We have lots of trade with China. That's obviously a major difference. One of the big themes in the book is talking about how the weapons of war have changed. And so today, dual-use technologies are becoming, what I call the new weapons of war. And the reason is that there is an inverse relationship between the degree of destructiveness of a weapon of political warfare and its practical usability in the conduct of day-to-day politics. And so to give you an example, if a country, if a government only has high-yield nuclear weapons at its disposal to carry out its agenda internationally, its only two policy options are going to be total annihilation of its adversaries and potential, retaliation on its country, or complete inaction. But if it has incredibly potent cyber weapons, it can actually carry out an agenda through the gray zone in ways that are incredibly effective, that avoid the cost of retaliation, and actually allow, and that are actually much, much more practical. And so that's why nowadays, you don't really see countries, you're seeing less of these Cold War style proxy wars, and you're seeing superpowers actually attacking each other. They're just doing it through cyberspace and the internet.
Okay. I'd like to give an opportunity to those in the audience to ask any questions. I do have one that's now come in on Zoom, and I'm happy to ask that, but I thought I'd start with those who are here in person, if there are any questions that you have for Jacob. All right, I'll go to the question on Zoom then, which is actually from an Elliott School student who is asking about the State Department's Global Engagement Center, right? The student, John Wynn, is a senior from the Elliott School and says, although the State Department has created the Global Engagement Center to counter disinformation, they haven't been engaged in a lot of activity until fairly recently. And they're asking why you think that might be. Also, what the connections are potentially to some of the disinformation that we're seeing and various foreign intelligence services, including Russian intelligence services.
So it's an excellent question. From my big conclusion from having worked in this space is that, first of all, it's incredibly important to parse out, when we talk about disinformation, people sometimes use those words to refer to very different things. So, there's foreign interference, which is one set of issues, there's hyperpartisan content, there's, politicians saying falsehoods online, and all those different issues there's hate speech, they're slightly different things. And so the remedies should also, it's important to think about the remedies in a slightly different way. With respect to the issue, I think one of the clearest cut issues that's actually easiest to tackle from a philosophical standpoint based on our laws and our constitution is actually the issue of foreign interference, because it is primarily an intelligence problem. We already have laws like the Foreign Agents Registration Act. we have all kinds of laws that actually provide legal authority to go after these issues. But the problem is that we have technology companies that aren't allowed to talk to each other. There is no centralized intelligence sharing framework between technology companies or between the private sector and the public sector. So the government has, all of the paper trail of money, the IRS data, the payments from obscure shell companies from Cyprus to these useful idiots in the US. And tech companies have, some of them have satellite imagery, some of them have ads payments data. They have all kinds of incredible data points, but it's very hard for tech companies to stitch that information together. And so ultimately, one of the recommendations that I outline in the book is for there to be a government entity office that actually does this kind of centralized intel analysis framework. The NDAA, I think it was in 2018, actually provided authorities for the creation of such an office, but the problem is that compliance is voluntary, not mandatory, and so obviously, people just give out, very, very little information to this office, and it's an office that exists in theory, but in practice doesn't really have a lot of heft. So I think if we take that model and strengthen it, it holds a lot of promise to tackle the specific issue of foreign governments trying to use our information environment in ways that could actually be very corrosive to free speech and a lot of the values that we hold there.
Interesting. Okay, so we now have quite a few questions rolling in from the audience. So I'm trying to just quickly scan through these as well. But the next question comes from Zach S., who writes that when discussing challenges in the US about technology and geopolitics, there often seems to be an issue of different cultures and values between Silicon Valley on the one hand, Capitol Hill, and the defense and intelligence communities. Do you think, or when do you think, who do you think is going to quote unquote blink first? And what values do you think may have to be compromised by each of these communities?
I don't know that I would approach the answer slightly more positively, in the sense that I don't think that either community is gonna be forced into submission, but I think that ultimately both communities should work together, because they should realize the fact is that the US, most of our most innovative technologies are not coming out of the Pentagon, they're coming out of the private sector. And that's just the reality. We have a system in the US, it's not like in China, we don't have civil military fusion. We have a private sector system where we're very fortunate to have innovators that come from all over the world building incredible things. And so ultimately, if you want the Pentagon to be competitive with China's hypersonic missiles or any of these other technologies, we have to have public-private collaboration in the space, and the government needs technology's input to do that. Conversely, one of the points that I make in the book is one of the issues that I think the tech industry often underappreciates is the fact that at the end of the day, our tech industry is only going to be successful as it's been, if it continues to operate in a world that is predominantly democratic, that has the rule of law, protection of intellectual property, protection of free flow of information. The rise of American technology companies has really happened because we have had this very relatively free world that has the rule of law and that allows companies to operate in a rules-based order. And if that goes away, they're going to be operating in a much, much more hostile environment. And so realizing that both communities actually have a vested interest in each other's success is incredibly important. And if I could just add one last point, I do think that that Zach hit the nail on the head with respect to highlighting the cultural gap between these two communities, because I do think that historically it actually has been one of the hurdles to more collaboration. A few examples that I give in the book are that obviously most of the people on Capitol Hill have a legal training background, former recovering attorneys. And most of the people in Silicon Valley have engineering backgrounds, product management backgrounds. The average age of an employee at Apple and Google are 31 and 32. The average age in the Senate is 63. So there is, these are people that have come of age with fundamentally different life experiences, very different generations, very different profiles in terms of appetite for risk. And, it's different constituencies, but yet, we have, the country needs these two communities to talk to each other more.
63 and I think trending older.
Trending older by the day.
Although I do think that something that we've been seeing in the last couple of years at least, is the staff, right, of those on the Hill, actually, a younger generation coming in very tech savvy, having more tech policy experience. However, just in recent weeks and months, we've seen quite a trend of Hill and even executive staffers who really are tech savvy, then moving back into the tech world, right? This kind of movement between the two spaces often raises concerns about capture, right? Regulatory capture. And I wonder, in your own experience, what you've seen in this and whether you are actually worried about that and how we can ultimately have appropriate knowledge here in DC to smartly establish policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's pros and cons to that. The pros is obviously it allows for, when there is, obviously the term revolving door has a really bad rep, but when there is a revolving door and when you have people that, rotate between the private sector and the public sector, that does help both communities build up their own institutional knowledge of, how the private sector works, how the public sector works. Obviously the drawback is if over time that leads to things like regulatory capture. I think that with respect to, there are so many different issues. I think you really have to think about this differently based on the issues that you're talking about. I think antitrust at the end of the day is pretty different than national security. So national security is actually one of the areas in the book where I'm more critical of the tech industry for, having had this very, post, an overly globalist approach to doing business where they think of themselves as global companies detached from, back in the lead up to World War II, this is an example that I provide in the book. GM, famously had the motto of "Victory is our business," and there was no question that these companies viewed themselves as American companies. Today, you have a situation when Denmark nominates their own standalone diplomatic envoy to Silicon Valley to basically engage with tech companies as a diplomatic peer that is being interacted with like a sovereign. And I think that it's important to just think about the basics and the fundamentals that at the end of the day, these are companies whose job it is to build products that people love and deliver value for shareholders, which is great. But it's in the preamble of our Constitution that it is the government's job to provide for the common defense of the country. And I think companies should be much more deferential to national security professionals on issues of national security. And fundamentally, I think it's the government's job to lay down what the ground rules should be, to define the parameters within which it's okay and not okay for tech companies to do business internationally. I've been a pretty vocal in Afghan CFIUS framework, for example, because I do think that Silicon Valley's involvement and efforts to do business in China has led to a lot of damage from the national security standpoint over the years. And so I think that that's an area where tech companies and the government are just not going to see eye to eye, and the government just needs to lay down the ground rules, say, you guys can do business internationally, but these are the rules within which you're allowed to do so, and go from there.
That's, I think, really, really interesting, your argument in this case, because there have actually been some experts, and I'm thinking especially of some of the work that's come out of the AI Now Institute, who have expressed concern that framing this sort of struggle as explicitly a war in war terms actually winds up helping the tech companies, positions them more strongly vis-a-vis, right, the regulators, vis-a-vis the government, because it allows them to say on the one hand, like, we're really the only ones who are able to address these very real problems, and they are war level problems. On the other, it empowers them to say more strongly that, more compellingly, that if you regulate us, right, you are embracing the values of China, right, and their values win out and not democratic values. And it also focuses efforts on militarized technology. I wonder how you would respond given your argument.
Yeah. There's a lot, I mean, that was a very interesting question that had a lot of different parts to it, but I think that the choice that we have today isn't really so much between, what makes our internet different from China's isn't that China's is a completely closed internet and ours is totally open and lawless. And today you're already seeing the internet start to look more and more like the physical world. Germany passed the hate speech law, the EU passed GDPR. And so I think what the difference is that we have an internet that's governed by laws that are democratic and that are the product of a independent legislative process reviewed by an independent judiciary, scrutinized by an open press. And that China has an internet that's governed by laws that are fundamentally autocratic, that are subject to no scrutiny, and where the goal is basically to centralize political power by a party, and specifically a person, which is obviously Xi Jinping. And so I don't think that passing laws in the US to, I would actually agree with tech companies that, I call it a war, and I think that we need tech companies to be successful, but I don't think that that should be used as a reason to not lay down ground rules to make sure that, I think where the argument of tech companies falls flat is that it makes no sense to say, we're in a war, we need to be strong and robust to help the US government, but we're still gonna do business with China. And so at the end of the day, you kind of have to pick a side. I mean, I wrote an article before writing the book that was entitled Silicon Valley Can't Be Neutral in the US-China Cold War. And so I think that, in the opening paragraph that Frank read, I do think that fundamentally one of the things that the tech industry struggles with is the fact that these systems are pretty incompatible and are very hard for tech companies to straddle. I mean, when you have a system in the US that's predicated on the protection of IP, the protection of personal privacy, the protection of free speech, and you're also complying with a legal system in China that has laws that are fundamentally contradictory. Imagine a scenario where you're a tech company, you have business in both countries, the Chinese government comes knocking on your door saying, we would like you to hand over all of the personal data of a Uyghur dissident that's located in the United States. Chinese national, he's located in the US. What are you going to do as a tech company? And obviously the backdrop is that if you don't comply, you might get shut down in China. So are you going to uphold US laws of personal privacy, or are you going to comply with China's national intelligence laws? It's very, very hard to comply with laws that are the reflection of values that are fundamentally contradictory.
Another question for you from the Q&A. This from Isabel Pellegrino, who says, I'm an SMPA grad who currently works in tech PR. With some of my clients like Samsung, GM, and AT&T, we're experiencing a shift where companies are being looked at to act like policymakers and manage policy, international issues like privacy, intelligence, and geopolitical tensions. I have no doubt that's something you saw very directly heading up policy for Google. What are your thoughts on how tech companies like this can better get ahead of these issues when the policies are still in development? And she asks because she's doing the communications work, especially through communications.
I mean, tech companies are in a bit of a tricky situation because the federal government hasn't legislated on this area. The buck does tend to get passed to tech companies to carry out these decisions. And the problem is that if tech companies basically say, okay, we have the proximity to understanding how the technology works, we're just going to help legislators come up with laws that make sense, that immediately becomes toxic because it's seen like tech companies are basically writing the rules that for policymakers. So it's a little bit of a tough situation, but at the end of the day, I think that it's really incumbent on the government for national security, to lay down clear ground rules for how it's okay and not okay for companies to do business abroad. And that includes things like export control, investments in supply chains. And it's heartwarming to hear that there's a lot of movement in Congress with respect to pushing for a potential outbound CPS framework in the next 24 months or so.
Another question that builds on a number of the things that you've been discussing here. So this from Martin Schultz, who asks how we can compete against our adversaries when Silicon Valley, big US tech, has somewhat of antipathy, which he describes bordering on hostility towards supporting the US government itself and US national security interests. So maybe more in sort of practical terms, besides just making the broad argument that they should, right, follow let the US government set these national security interests, do you have practical ideas about how we might do this, or what you would tell, right, the companies, the leaders of the companies to do? Because as Martin points out, right, our adversaries don't have these sorts of issues.
Yeah.
They often just tell the companies and it's done.
Yeah. I think that the two things that I think could go a long way are, the first is, I think that the president or our political leaders, whether it's Speaker of the House, President, communicate to Silicon Valley executives. I think that part of the issue is that there's an enormous amount of idealism. I worked in Google during Project Maven, for example, so I kind of saw this unfold in real time. And for those that aren't familiar, Project Maven was this project that there was a debate about whether or not Google would participate in a project issued by the Pentagon to help the Pentagon develop technology that was about computer vision and image recognition, but where the concern was ultimately that this technology can be used in theaters of war. And so Google, a constituency of Google employees who are very idealistic, basically wrote this letter which leaked to the press where they said, we don't want a company to join the ranks of Raytheon, we don't want to work for a defense contractor. And because I think the idea of war is very icky and dirty and scary to a lot of people in Silicon Valley. But I think at the end of the day, part of what that misses is the fact that whether it's Google or Apple or Facebook, they're only going to be able to continue to be large companies and successful companies if they're allowed to operate in a world that runs on the rule of law. And I think, by now there's more than enough evidence to show that a world where China writes the rules of the internet, Americans companies will lose. And, you can not take my word for it. You can just take Xi Jinping's word for it, where, take any of the many speeches he's given that lays out very clearly that their aim isn't to compete, it's to dominate. And so, and I think that the failure to appreciate that is something that could potentially be corrected. But then, the second point that I was going to make is that I think that inspiring CEOs is one part of it, but then also just a constant recurrent challenge that the US government faces is the fact that, we do have pockets of industries that are still clinging to this, pipe dream of doing business in the Chinese market, which so rarely ends up panning out. And I mean, obviously today, most of the software companies are banned in China, whether it's Netflix, Google, Facebook, most of the content platforms are banned in China. China still allows hardware companies because it sees strategic value in having hardware made in China through their 51-49% joint venture framework. But Hollywood and Wall Street, for example, are two major holdouts in terms of American industries that still are trying to do a lot of business in China, and that drastically slows, the policymaking process in terms of being able to get private industry on board with a lot of important policy initiatives. So, the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think inspiring CEOs with a clear message, but also passing an outbound CFIUS framework to simply say, you guys aren't allowed to invest pension fund money and American retirement accounts in a market that, where that money is going to end up in the hands of the PLA, who are the very people that we're trying to compete with. And I think that's a very common sense step that, would be very digestible to the public.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. So I want to ask, we just have a few minutes left. I want to ask two final questions that bring the discussion back to where we are today, right? Sitting in DC at GW in particular. The first is, what can scholars, academic researchers, and universities as institutions be doing, focusing on differently in order to contribute to solutions to this problem?
I think, so first of all, let me just applaud the work that everyone at GW has done over the years. And it's so fun to be here and have this conversation with familiar faces, Frank and Dr. Foster, and who, for folks who don't know, was an advisor of mine when I was writing one of my senior year papers. And so I think trying to lead the way in terms of encouraging young people that have an intellectual appetite to research this space to be original in their thinking and to not be afraid to question sacred cows and think independently, I think is the best possible way to encourage creative thinking, creative ideas. And then obviously encouraging people to just talk to policymakers, talk to practitioners that work in industry, collecting feedback from different groups of people to understand different sides. These issues are never easy, and if they were easy, they would have been solved a long time ago. And these are issues where reasonable people land in different places, and so collecting feedback from different perspectives is actually incredibly useful to kind of understand the bigger picture of these problems.
So the final question for you, along similar lines, but to the students in the audience. We have a number of students who have joined us over Zoom in particular. You have had I gather from what you said a minute ago, your 11 short years since GW, an amazing career. You've done incredible things. What would you do? What would you say to inspire the students who are in the audience now and want to do things very much like what you've done? What's your advice to them?
I think one of the things that has served me incredibly well is to just being willing to take risks and to trust your gut in certain situations. Obviously one shouldn't be careless. There's no point in taking risks just for the point of taking risks, but thinking through having enough, the ability to think independently, to not be dragged into going down a path just because it feels like everyone is going, all your peers are going down the same path, but thinking, what is it that you're really passionate about? Who are the other people in spaces that you're passionate about? Talking with them, getting feedback on, what it's like to work in an industry or in a company that you're interested in, and being willing to be bold and take some risks, even when it's sometimes a little bit scary.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Jacob, for taking the time to talk with all of us. It's been a pleasure to engage with you to read the book, which is fantastic. I'll do my final Jon Stewart moment. Please go out, pick it up. I highly recommend. It's worth the read. I genuinely learned a great deal from it. So thank you for taking the time. Welcome back to GW and for your continued engagement with the university.
Thanks so much for having me.